Okay, we're chapter 4, verse 2 of Isaiah. Then let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask your protection for the people who are threatened by the fires, your protection for the people who are fighting them. We ask this in the name of Jesus the Lord. Okay, 4:2 is the beginning of a short poem, and the title of it is The Lord's Seedling. And I think I mentioned to you that the prophecies of Isaiah took over a long period of time, and sometimes it's difficult to sort out where they come from, but they're oftentimes independent of one another. They're set apart. So he says, that day the Lord's seedling shall be beauty and glory. And what he's talking about there is the way the faith starts. It's a seedling both in a person and in the community. It's a seedling, and it starts out very, very strong, very, very small. But he says, the seedling shall be beauty and glory. The fruit of the land shall be pride and ornament of Israel's survivors. And the difficulty is that so few of the Jews survived, particularly in the early, the early exiles. Very, very few of the Jews were left. We tend to think of Jerusalem as this big city now, but it wasn't that at the time. It was a very, very small village. And so the loss of the community was actually devastating. But he says that they shall be important. But he's using the idea of the seedlings. He says that this small group of people is in fact now the source of what Israel will become, and promises that. We're in chapter 4. Verse 3, Isaiah. Yeah. He says, those who are left in Zion and remain in Jerusalem shall be called holy, and all those in Jerusalem marked out for life. And the idea is that, I think a small town at that time was very vulnerable, because you had these roving mobs of bandits and stuff like that. So they were extremely, extremely vulnerable. But this idea that if God has marked you out for life, you're going to live, So he said that. He says, when the Lord has washed away the filth of Zion's daughters, and with the wind of judgment and the wind of burning, cleansed Jerusalem of the blood shed in her, the Lord will create over ever dwelling on Mount Zion, over all its palaces of assembly, a cloud by day and by night smoke with the brilliance of a flaring fire. Okay, that's the smoke and the fire are from the Exodus. If you remember that they were led by what appeared to be a pillar of fire at night, and during the day it appeared to be a pillar of smoke. So it was a fire with smoke outside it. When it was dark, you saw the fire. When it was light, you saw the smoke. And it led them, and it's what led them into the Holy Land and led them away from the dangers of Egypt. So I said it will be like that. And again, it's hard to imagine the natural state of Israel at this time with so few people and a devastated city, the walls gone, and not enough people even to populate it as a city. Just very, very few people left. There's a theology that comes out of this, and it's called the theology of the Anawim. And the Anawim, I guess the best translation of the word, they normally translate it as poor, but probably an even better word, the Anawim are the abandoned. And what they would do is when they would conquer a city like Jerusalem, you'd kill all the politicians. First of all, that's the thing. Everyone in government was murdered, so it wasn't all bad. But they would come in and they would do away with these people, and then the next thing they would do is enslave people. And the major people they wanted to enslave were craftsmen and artisans. They wanted them enslaved because they wanted those talents in their society. And the rest of us, they would just enslave to do work, okay? But there are two groups of people they did not enslave. One was people who were too old or too crippled to be of any help to them at all. And two would be people who were so young they couldn't make the trip. And so these people would be abandoned. And the idea is these people normally in most cities did not survive. They all died there in the city, and that was the end of it. And so God is pronouncing this over these people. He says, you have been marked out for life. And so he lets this little group know that God's protection is on them. He says, for over all, glory will be a canopy, and a tent to give shade by day from heat, and a refuge and shelter from the storm and the rain. And basically, God says, I will provide for you what the city can't. The city can't protect you, I will. Can't keep you dry, I will. Can't cause you to survive, I will. Can't have you live, I will. That God becomes the thing. One of the themes we find very, very strong in the what do you want to call it, the Jewish scriptures as you go through it, is a theme that God looks back on the Exodus as though it's a honeymoon, because the people had nothing to do but to deal with God. They didn't have to do farming, he fed them, they didn't have to do anything but pay attention to God. And God always kind of looked back at that as a honeymoon with the Jewish people. And so he's actually speaking in those terms here, that, you can't do these things. It's not that you don't, but you simply can't. And during the Exodus, they didn't. But here he says, you simply can't, but I will provide all of that, and ultimately it will come. This theology of the Anawim is that over a long period of time in history, that happened in Israel over and over and over again. So that with the different exiles, what was left, the Anawim, the abandoned, ultimately would build into the new society. And happens so often, it becomes a theme in their liturgy. If you know the Magnificat, Mary's prayer, he says, he looks upon the lowliness of his servant. That means he looks upon, and the word there is the Anawim. He looks upon the Anawim. And it's the idea that a person who is helpless, God tends to take care of. I always, the thing I like to think of with regards to it, if we could put a blackboard up here, just put a huge blackboard, and each one of us rate our talents as being important or big, or things we're really good at and things we're terrible at, and then sort of create this graph that would look like, a series of mountains, basically. And you put it all together like that. These are where you're strong and where you're weak. But the thing that's interesting is if you take this and then pour the Holy Spirit in, the Spirit is strongest where you're weakest. Because that's where the power of the Spirit is. And consistently, God does that in the thing. Like, you look at the apostles, who was the best person to teach the Jews, who knew the Torah and understood it, was a rabbi? Paul. He sent to the Gentiles. Who sent to the Jews? A fisherman. So that becomes Peter's thing, okay? And God consistently, and that's something that you understand, like when he looks on peoples of the world, like the Jews at one point are pestering him to find out why they're chosen. And God tells them, you were the least significant people on the face of the earth. So the power of God had to come upon them, So again, if we put the nations there, you pour in God, it's all in the weaker nations. Okay? And that's something to know about our lives when we stand in the presence of God, that God ultimately will work through our weaknesses. And that's consistent. And the interesting thing about the weaknesses, again, once you begin to get the Spirit working in that way, then you turn the whole thing over, and your high points are where the Spirit is. And actually, that's what the world sees. Only you know where the Spirit is in your life. The world just looks at what you're really good at or what you're really rotten at. But the Spirit will make you really good at what you know you aren't good at. And then you will know the Spirit did it. And I think that's a great power. And if I were just to use a simple example, I've told all of you on many occasions I have a practically crippling dyslexia. So God gave my entire life to a book. That's just the way he likes to play the game. Okay? So, and that's why Paul will talk about glorying in his weaknesses and stuff like that. That's what God uses. He says, "Let me sing for my beloved his song for his vineyard." Now it's basically a parable, this. He says, "My beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it out, cleared it of stones, and planted it with choice grapes." Okay? And the basic way you did this is much like, I don't know if you've ever been to the countryside in New York, but in the countryside in New York, there are famous rock walls all over the countryside that are protected by law. You cannot touch them. But when they first came, the very first settlers, what they did was block out the piece of land they were going to farm and put all the rocks on the edge of it, and the person next over put their rocks on the edge of it. So these rock walls separated the property. But they did that in Israel too. You clear the rocks so that you can, do the vineyard, and the rocks then create the perimeters or the walls of it, and plants it with choice grapes. In the middle, he builds a watchtower. You built a watchtower in the grape area because there were two things you had to be afraid of. You had to be afraid of foxes when the foxes had kits, the baby foxes, and that's at a certain time of the year. You don't need to be afraid. Foxes are very good in a vineyard if they're adults, because a fox in a vineyard eats the things that eat the grapes. It'll, pick out rabbits and stuff like that, but the fox will eat what bothers the grapes. The problem with the kit foxes is they're just playing. And so they damage the grapes and this sort of thing. So you would be in the thing at that time. And one of the curious things, you don't think of this unless you visit Israel, but one of the curious things of Israel, it's one of the most important places in the world for bird watchers. And that's because it's on the migratory track of so many different birds, not that settle there, but if they're going up or going down, they go through that area with great frequency. Well, when birds are migrating and you have grapes in your field, you better have someone in the watchtower. And so anyway, they have the watchtower. And he hewed a press there too. And a press was usually, he said hewed, they would cut it out of rock, and then you would crush the grapes in it. And they usually had a hole kind of in the bottom that was blocked, but the grape juice would come out. And the reason they did that is that they very seldom ate grapes. And so what they used the grapes for was largely wine. And if you're using the grapes for wine, it's much less heavy to just take the juice out and leave the rest of the grape there. So they would do that. And what they call grape mash, the Jews would largely use on the fields. One thing they made with it at times, and they'll talk about them periodically, they talk about sweet cakes or raisin cakes. and they would let them dry to raisins, let what's left dry to raisins, and they would pack it together and make a little like cake out of it, and you put in just a little fermented wine and leave that, and the whole thing kind of ferments. It's not really high in alcohol, but it has a nice flavor. And so they used to do that with the mash as well. But most of the mash would normally be used to fertilize the field. He wanted for it to yield fine grapes, but rotting grapes was all it yielded. And the thing to notice about it, what they've talked about here, about they cleared it with stones, they've done all this, this is the formula for getting good grapes. If you don't clear it of stones, a lot of times there are insects that are left in, that hide in the rocks and feed on the grapes. There are all kinds of things that can make the grapes, really bad. But he's done everything. And yet, once it's all finished, it's still yielding rotting grapes. And that's God's view of Israel. He said, what did I do? I took you out of Egypt. I brought you out of slavery. I brought you into this land. I settled you down. I gave you protection. What do I get? Okay? And so he says, so now let me tell you what I shall do to my vineyard. I shall take away the hedge, and it will be grazed upon. I will knock down the wall, and then it will be trampled. I shall turn it into a wasteland, unpruned, undug, and on it briars and thorns. Grapes really needed to be cultivated, particularly in the Mideast. I think the grape is not natural to the Mideast, but they would plant them. What's natural to the Mideast are plants that need very little water, and normally thorny plants grow there. So they would return to briars and thorns. I shall command the clouds to send no rain upon it. Now the vineyard of the Lord Sabaoth is the house of Israel. He says that's what's going on in Israel. So he says everything necessary, the protection of the wall and the nourishment of the water that he'd given to them and produced nothing. So why should he waste these things on it? He says, and the people of Judah, the plant he cherished, he awaited fair judgment, but found injustice, awaited righteousness, but found crimes of distress. And the thing I'd like you to notice is he awaited fair justice, fair judgment, but found injustice. The most important quality that the Jews saw for God was justice. And I think it's curious that we always, when we think of God, we think of mercy. But for them, ultimately, they were under such unjust conditions with regards to governments and stuff like that. All they wanted was justice. They just wanted equality. They weren't interested in this thing. And so as a thing, what they want from God is this equality. So God is trying to tell them, that then as a result of that, you have to give justice to the people you're dealing with too. Now we go into warnings against the wealthy. He says, woe to you who add house to house and join field to field until there is no space left and you alone inhabit the country. Okay? And it's the typical thing of wealthy people being able to accumulate. But there's an added thing to this. When the Jews entered Israel, God assigned property to families. I think it's in the book of Numbers. But each family had a property to its own name. And one of the things that took place in the history of Israel is that they had what was called a Jubilee year. and every Jubilee year your land would return to you. And the Jubilee year is actually a celebration of the sovereignty of God, that God's in charge of the land, you aren't. But as a result of that, if it's 10 years to the Jubilee year, and incidentally the Jubilee was every 50 years, what you have is a week of weeks. A week is 7 days, okay? So they would have 7 years. 7 batches of 7 years is 49. The 50th year then is the Jubilee year. And in the Jubilee year, the land would return. But if it was 10 years to the Jubilee year, if I bought the land from you, I would know I would only have it for 10 years. If I bought the land from you and it's 50 years to the Jubilee year, then I'll have it for 50 years. But the wealthy people, over a period of time, were able to circumvent this to the point where they had enough money that each time the Jubilee year came up, they would buy it from you right again. And that they eventually, and these families then came not even to know where their land was. It disappeared from their name. He says, the Lord Sabaoth has sworn this in my hearing. Many houses will be turned into ruins, and great and fine ones left untended. For 10 acres of a vineyard will yield only 1 barrel, and 10 bushels of seed will yield but 1 bushel. So remember we talked about earlier that the rains would stop and this sort of thing. So he says, the land you paid so much for now will give you nothing, okay? So he says, woe to those who rise early in the pursuit of strong drink and stay up late at night inflamed with wine. Their feasts have harp, lyre, tambourine, pipe, and wine. But never a thought for the works of the Lord, never a glance at the works of his hands. A verse like this is particularly important to scholars because it lets you know musical instruments that were used at a set time in history, okay? But this idea of never a thought for the works of the Lord, but never a glance at the works of his hands, the thing that's going on here is how much, and something even I think to consider in our own lives, how much we enjoy the benefits of God's work on earth and how little we recognize that it is God's work on earth. And I think one of the interesting things about grace, for instance, we Catholics are very into communal prayer. So into communal prayer, you have to have a standard text so that everyone knows what to say. Pentecostals are more into, spontaneous prayer, but then only one person says it. The rest say amen. But I think because we are into this kind of prayer, when we're eating a meal, I think sometimes we don't recognize how much of God's works and how much of the efforts of other people and how much of all of that goes into the meal. And I don't particularly like a grace, personally. I don't particularly like a grace that's like a list of credits. Sometimes, we thank Mabel for the potato salad. Her salad is always, and we thank, I'm less than enamored of that. But the idea to recognize there are people in the world who are not eating what we're eating. There are people in the world who don't have what we have. And a lot of those people have prepared what we're eating. I think it's I saw an interesting program. It was somewhere in Africa where they were harvesting lobster. And so they were harvesting this lobster. I forget, one side of Africa, the waters are cold, and that's where the lobster are. They're in cold water. So anyway, they're harvesting the lobster, and they were interviewing one of the men, and they were saying how great it was to do the lobster and everything. And in the conversation, you found out the man had never tasted lobster. He says, we can't afford it. He says, we've never tasted it. Anyway, he says, therefore, for want of knowledge, my people are exiled. Okay? Now, want of knowledge, what's the knowledge? It's the want of the knowledge of God's law. First of all, with God's law about where the land is supposed to be. Secondly, with God's law about why creatures are to be taken care of. I told you about rounding corners and stuff. The ignorance of God's law. And what happens is the knowledge is gone. One of the texts I really like is called the Watchman text. And in the Watchman text, God's telling one of the prophets that they're supposed to tell the people, kind of what's going on. And the prophet is kind of uncomfortable with this because he knows it's not welcome news or something. And God tells him very clearly, he says, if you tell them and they don't do it, they're responsible. If you don't tell them and they don't do it, you are responsible. And it's this idea that they no longer have the knowledge and that people, shut up. I think of how many people who, it's interesting, you don't hear it much as a discussion anymore, but how many people so long talked against there being any climate change going on. And then finally they admitted there was climate change, but was always all due to nature. There were sequences like this all the time. And then they're finally beginning to admit that it's largely the work of human beings. But the thing is that to the degree knowledge is denied people, they not only make bad choices, they don't have the ability to make the good choice. Okay, that's what knowledge does. Knowledge gives people the ability to make the good choice, whether they make it or not. It says, her nobles are starving, her common people parched with thirst. Therefore, Sheol stretches wide its mouth and opens its jaw beyond limit. Sheol, oftentimes we connect Sheol with hell. It isn't. For them, Sheol means to be dead. That's all. It's not reward, it's not punishment, it's anything. Sheol is just to be dead. So death opens wide its mouth to receive them. While down to her go nobles and common people, her loud revelers merry to the last. Okay? So this merry to the last, they never ever turn to God, even while they watch this disintegrating, And I always thought that was a very strange thing, because it's hard for me to imagine that going on. But when you look at the world today, like with the climate change, all the information was there for anyone who knew. Or right now, the vaccine, people who refuse to get the vaccine. It's just, and they end up destroying themselves. I saw a cartoon the other day in a paper of, the usual thing where all the lemmings are going off the cliff. They were all carrying Trump flags. And just the whole crew going over the cliff. And it's really strange. People refuse to understand or to act on these things. He says, human nature has been humbled, humankind brought low. The eyes of the proud have been humbled. The Lord Sabaoth shall be exalted in judgment. And exalted in judgment, the thing is, in what's going on, they are going to recognize that God was right in what God told them, how he told them to act and everything. God was essentially right. They will recognize it. God the Holy One will display his holiness in righteousness. Lambs will graze in their pastures, and the sheep will feed in the ruins. Okay? And this lambs graze in their pastures, what they're talking about is the lambs are grazing on what they're trying to raise. Okay? That this isn't seen as a positive thing. It says, woe to those who dig in guilt by the cords of deception and drag in sin as though with a cart rope. Okay? This, a drag in guilt by cords of deception. And we've been through this several times, but in the Bible, the necessary thing for a sin is a lie. Every sin has to begin with a lie. And oftentimes it begins by us lying to ourselves about what we can do or one thing or another. But you remember the prototypical sin in the Bible is Adam and Eve. And so the snake comes to Eve and says, I understand God says you can't eat of any of the trees in the garden. Eve said, no, that's not true. There's only one tree we may not eat of. And then she lies. And we may not even touch it. God never said don't touch it. Once the lie is processed, and even if the lie is, in that case, the lie was stricter rather than lax. Like a lax lie was, God said we could just have one or two. That would be lax. But strict is we can't even touch it. And it doesn't matter which direction the lie goes. Satan plays that game with people. You sometimes think if you lie in favor of strictness, that somehow that's pleasing to God. It's not. It goes either way is a lie. And so in cords of deception, then they drag in guilt. And then they drag in sin as though with a cart rope. He says that they just drag sin into a community. And it's oftentimes that there can be peripheral things that make a sin. An example would be drugs. You know, the really important people involved in drugs have not and do not take drugs. But they drag this into society, and for them, it's money, it's not drugs. And you see this in there are a lot of things in our society that are really very corrupt things, but people are involved in them largely because in our society it's money. Those who say, let him hurry to do his work that we may see it. Let the plan of the Holy One of Israel come quickly that we may know it. In other words, we want to see God do it all perfectly without our cooperation. We want, it's the old thing, do you give a person a fish or teach them to fish? And the fact is that God, I believe that when we come before God with requests, if we will pay attention, God tells us how to get what we're asking for. But he does not very often just hand it to you. I don't think that works that way. I think he lets you know how to do it. He says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. And again, I can't help when I read these texts but think in terms of the COVID thing, where you have someone saying that we will not allow people to wear masks in the school. And then someone saying, if you don't wear masks in the school, everyone's going to die. There's just so many people who pull in a lie and promote it as truth, just flat out promote it as truth. And I think it's reached a point where it doesn't bother us. I think people with an ounce of sense can tell the difference. But I think that what you see going on in the United States right now is that people will look at a lie not as whether it's true or false, but how it profits me. If it profits me, then the lie is acceptable. The fact it's a lie doesn't matter. Okay? Woe to those who are valiant in swilling wine, whose heroism is in strong drinks, and who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the righteous of their rights. Notice he's talking here about justice, too. A lot about justice. Therefore, as the flame devours the stubble, as the straw flares up and disappears, their root will rot, their shoot will be carried off like dust, for having rejected the law of the Lord Sabaoth, for having despised the word of the Holy Lord, one of Israel. The thing to understand, oftentimes when we read these texts, we get the impression that if we do X, God punishes us by doing Y. But the nature of the text is that if you do X, it makes Y happen. It isn't as though God, it's kind of like if I drink too much, God does not send me a hangover. The hangover is in the bottle, okay? And when, different things we do, the punishment is connected with what we do. I always like that one with regards to Shakespeare, with regards to lying. What a tangled web we weave. Once you begin to lie, then you have to remember what you told each person and try and, it becomes a very, very complex thing. But that isn't God's punishment. That's the nature of lying. That's just what it does. I think the thing to do is to come to the realization that God's law is given to me for my benefit, not because of anything he gets out of it. And that God forbids things, not because they're wrong, but because they're bad for me. And that's what his law is supposed to do. Now we go to the one who is going to invade them. Therefore, the Lord's anger has blazed against his people, and he's raised his hand against them to strike. The mountains quaked, corpses lie like garbage in the streets. After all this, his anger is not spent, and his hand is still outstretched. Okay? Now, what's going on here? Is this the punishment of God? What has happened is, remember the idea of the drought and the things happening to the crops? They're becoming very, very weak, and the nations around them are noticing this. So the particular nation that intervenes here is Assyria. So he says, he hosts a signal to a distant nation. He whistles it up from the ends of the earth. See how swift, how fleet they come. None of them are tired. None of them are stumbling. No one is asleep or drowsy. No belt unfastened. No sandal strap broken. So all this might from this other thing is coming against them when they are so weakened. Their arrows are sharpened. Their bows are all strong. Their horses' hooves are reckoned like flint, and their wheels a whirlwind. This wheels is probably an added thing later, largely because in Israel they did not fight with chariots. That's because it's a mountainous area, so they didn't use that. Chariots were used like in Egypt on the sands and stuff like that. So he says their roar is like that of a lion. Like young lions they roar. Growling, they seize their prey and carry it off with no one to rescue it. And I think in the jungle, the ones that make the noise are the powerful ones, and the others kind of keep their silence. And so the Assyrians knew they would win, so they would come on. He says, roaring over it that day, like the roaring of a sea. Look at the land, darkness and distress, and the light is darkened by the clouds. Okay? So what we see here then is that they have been consistently given blessings by God and set up. They abandon all that. It falls all apart, and now they're being invaded by another country. And now we begin one of the prophecies of deliverance, the Emmanuel prophecy. It says, in the year of the king Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne. His train filled the sanctuary. Above him stood seraphs, each one with 6 wings. 2 covered its face, 2 each covered its feet, and with 2 it flew. Feet is what do you call it? It means genitals. It's the way they would say it in Scripture. And each cried out to one another. So that the seraphim are basically their wings that are their clothing, and there's wings to fly, and because they stand in the presence of God, their wings cover their face. You don't look upon God. Okay, so this is the way it's out. And each one cries to another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Sabaoth. His glory fills the whole earth." When you're dealing with people at this time in history, not a lot of people could read and write, and probably what was most important to them was numbers, and the symbol of numbers is replete in the Scriptures. It's all over it, even in the book of Revelation at the end. And when you come to something that's triple, holy, 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 means it's stable. And where that comes from is the idea of a 3-legged stool. It sits solid, okay? And you have to be very clever to get a 4-legged stool to sit straight. And of course, a 2-legged is impossible. But this idea of the triple thing means stability. And in the Scriptures, the triple holy is only spoken of God. You never do that. Like we're called God's holy people, but never a triple holy, okay? So his glory fills the entire earth. So first of all, they talked about this vision of God in heaven, but his glory fills the earth. And God's glory is seen actually through people, okay? And Teilhard de Chardin would be a good example of this. Teilhard de Chardin sees nature. Nature is to God the Father what the body was to Jesus in the incarnation. So that plants and animals, everything, God can speak to us through all those things constantly in his ways. The doorpost shook at the sound of their shouting, and the temple was full of smoke. And then I said, so now we see this vision takes place in the temple. And if you remember the seraphim, there are 2 of them on top of the Ark of the Covenant. So he's probably seeing the Ark of the Covenant in the temple as probably evolving into this vision as he sees it. Okay? He says, then I said, woe am me, I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Sabaoth. Now, it's interesting in much of the Bible, they've gone through editings. And the interesting thing, when you edit a book of the Bible, you can't edit all the copies. And so we can watch the way texts evolve and actually where they're edited. This is the sort of thing that will be edited out of later editions. Later editions will never have anyone seeing God. I'll give you an example. If you read several accounts in different places of Jacob's vision, that it says he wrestled with God. But many of them edited now and say he wrestled with an angel. It's so that you don't have him looking at God and dying, okay? And so they were uncomfortable. We know where those are, though, pure and simple. He certainly wrestled with an angel and wrestled with God. But so he sees this. And why is he seeing this? Now, the prophet we're talking about, Isaiah, is a very holy and a noble man who stands, as I mentioned, stands as a very important person in Israel, even in his day. And what's going on here is it's very difficult to appear holy in the presence of God, no matter how holy you are. You don't appear holy in the presence of God. And that's what's happening here. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding in its hand a live coal, which it had taken from the altar with a pair of thongs. With it, it touched my mouth and said, "Look, this has touched your lips. Your guilt's been removed. Your sin has been forgiven." Okay, so he's standing before God, very conscious of his weakness or whatever. And then the angel comes and says, "You're purified." Okay? And notice it's particularly on the lips because he's speaking God's word. So that's the thing. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" And I said, "Here I am." And the idea is that once he's cleansed by God, then he's free to fulfill a mission that he didn't even think he was worthy to hear of. And I think the kind of the way that works in the presence of God, I think that God sort of leads people slowly into really, really dramatic things if you're open to God. And I would look at someone like Mother Teresa. I doubt if God ever asked her in 4th grade if she would like to spend her life picking dying people out of the gutters of Calcutta. But we do know that as a little girl, she was very kind and helpful to people around her, particularly people who other people didn't want to be with. They watched that go on in her. And so that what you're watching is the beginning. You suddenly, move along. Who would ever think they could do what Mother Teresa did? No one thinks that at the beginning. It's just this slow, methodical growth. And then God said, "Go and say to my people, listen, but do not understand. Look, but do not perceive. Make this people's heart coarse. Make their ears dull, shut their eyes, or they will look, and with their eyes to see, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and change their ways and be healed." So he says, I'm sending you to these people, and I can tell you right now, they won't listen to you, they won't receive you, or do any of these things, and they won't change. And why is he saying this? Now again, the Jewish scriptures, God causes everything. But why is he saying this? He's saying this so that Isaiah will not think his mission has failed because people aren't accepting what he's saying. He says, I tell you, this is what's going to happen. And what's the significance of the prophecy of Isaiah if it's ignored? The significance is the next generation could look back and say, the prophet said this, and that is what happened. So maybe we should listen to our prophet, okay? Then I said, until when, Lord? And he replied, until towns are in ruins and without inhabitants, houses without people, and land utterly desolate. And the Lord has sent the people away, and the land is totally abandoned. So in other words, and when the Lord sends the people away, he's describing the exile that takes place with the Assyrians as they come in. And suppose 1/10 of them is left in it. Will it be stripped again, like the terebinth, like the oak, at a stalk at its telling? Its stalk is a holy seed. And so what God says, that it's going to be destroyed, but it's going to be destroyed in the same way you trim a plant. It is destroyed in order to flower and ultimately will come back. And from here, anyway, we move on to the 7 that's going into another aspect. So we'll pick up chapter 7, verse 1 next time. We'll see if there are any questions and then go.